I noticed the flowers on the third morning after the world ended. Fresh-cut lilies, white as bone, arranged in a glass jar beside the grave of Margaret Holloway, 1948 to 2019. The cemetery sat on the eastern ridge above Grayfield, and from its iron gates you could see the whole town spread below like a wound that hadn't yet learned to bleed. 3 days since the infection swept through our valley. 3 days since the sirens stopped. 3 days since I'd locked myself inside the groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of the burial grounds, surviving on canned soup and the kind of silence that makes you forget your own name. But someone was leaving flowers. I'm Daniel Morse, 41 years old, former high school history teacher. I'd been volunteering at the Grayfield Cemetery Heritage Trust for 6 years when the outbreak reached us. Maintaining records, leading tours, helping old Mrs. Chen catalog headstones that dated back to 1867. The cottage came with the volunteer position. A single room with a wood stove, a cot, and a view of 400 graves arranged in neat rows beneath oak trees that had been growing since before the Civil War. When the emergency broadcasts started, I didn't leave. I told myself it was strategic. The cemetery was isolated, elevated, surrounded by a stone wall. The dead here were properly dead. The recently dead were down in town. And down in town is where they stayed for those first terrible hours, tearing through the living with a speed that the news anchors couldn't quite bring themselves to describe accurately. The first infected I saw was Carl Engstrom, Tuesday evening, maybe 6 hours after the initial reports. He came staggering up Cemetery Hill Road, with his postal uniform half torn from his body. And even from 200 yards, I could see that something fundamental had broken inside him. The way he moved wasn't walking. It was mechanical repetition without destination. Legs cycling forward because the signal to stop had been severed. I watched from the cottage window as he reached the cemetery gate. Pressed against the iron bars for 11 minutes, then turned and descended back toward town. He never looked up. He never made a sound. That night, I heard Grayfield die, not all at once, in waves. A scream from the residential district, glass shattering near the commercial center. 3 gunshots spaced 40 seconds apart from somewhere near the school. Then, around 2 in the morning, a period of absolute silence, more terrifying than everything that preceded it. By Wednesday morning, I'd inventoried my supplies. 14 cans of soup, 8 cans of beans, a case of bottled water. The cottage had no electricity. The power had failed Tuesday night. But the wood stove still worked, and there was a cord of split oak stacked against the eastern wall. I had a hand axe, a flashlight with dying batteries, and a pocket knife. I had the stone wall. I had elevation and sight lines. I had convinced myself I was prepared. Then Thursday morning, while making my perimeter check along the wall's northern stretch, I saw them. Fresh lilies, white, arranged with obvious care in a clean glass jar, positioned at the base of Margaret Holloway's headstone in Section C, Row 7. I stood there for a long time. The jar hadn't been there Wednesday evening. I was certain of that because I'd walked that exact path at dusk, checking for breaches in the wall. Someone had come in the night. Someone had walked through a cemetery in a dead town during an extinction-level outbreak to leave flowers for a woman who'd been buried 7 years ago. I knelt beside the jar. The lilies were freshly cut. The water was clean. Whoever had done this wasn't scavenging or fleeing or hiding. They were performing an act of deliberate tenderness in a world that had abandoned the concept entirely. I scanned the cemetery. 400 headstones. Silent oaks. Morning fog dissolving against the ridge. Nothing moved. No one appeared. But someone had been here. Someone was still human enough to remember the dead while the living were being consumed. I needed to know who. I spent Thursday cataloging what I knew about Margaret Holloway. The Heritage Trust records were stored in 3 filing cabinets inside the cottage. Paper records, because Mrs. Chen had always insisted that digital systems were one power failure away from oblivion. She'd been right about that, at least. Margaret Holloway, born 1948, died 2019. Buried in Section C, Row 7, Plot 14. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest. Next of kin, 1 daughter, Ruth Holloway Park. Listed address on Maple Drive in downtown Grayfield. Spouse, deceased. Walter Holloway, buried adjacent, Plot 15. No other family connections in the records. Ruth Holloway Park. I didn't know her personally, but 6 years of cemetery work gives you a sense of the regulars. Someone had maintained Margaret's grave meticulously. Fresh flowers every Sunday, the grass trimmed, the headstone cleaned quarterly. That would have been Ruth, a devoted daughter keeping ritual alive. But Maple Drive was in the heart of downtown, the heart of the infection zone. I'd watched that area burn orange on Tuesday night when something, a gas main, a knocked-over candle, chaos itself, had ignited a structure fire that consumed half a block before exhausting its fuel. Anyone on Maple Drive was dead or turned or had fled before the roads were blocked. Yet someone had left flowers. Thursday morning, fresh. I decided to watch. That evening, I positioned myself inside the maintenance shed near Section C. The shed had a window facing Row 7, and if I kept the interior dark, I'd be invisible to anyone approaching from the cemetery's 3 access points. The main gate on Cemetery Hill Road, the service entrance on the eastern slope, and the gap in the southern wall where frost had collapsed to Section 2 winters ago. I brought a blanket, water, and the hand axe. I sat in darkness and waited. The hours moved like something wounded. From my position, I could see down the hill into Grayfield. No lights, no movement. The town existed as pure absence, a shape without content. I thought about my students, 26 juniors in my American history class. Had any of them made it out? The evacuation orders had come too late. The highways had gridlocked within the first hour. I'd heard the traffic reports on the radio before the stations went silent. Route 9 blocked, the interstate impassable, people abandoning cars and running into the woods. I thought about Ellen, my ex-wife. She'd moved to Portland 3 years ago. Portland was 400 miles away. Portland might as well have been another planet at 4:47 a.m. I know because I was watching my wind-up clock with desperate focus. I heard the southern wall, not a breach, a sound. Footsteps on gravel, careful and deliberate. Someone who knew where the loose stones were. I pressed against the shed window. The pre-dawn darkness was thick, but a quarter moon gave enough light to see shapes. A figure moved between the headstones in Section B, heading towards Section C. Small, wearing a dark coat, carrying something in both hands. The figure reached Margaret Holloway's headstone, knelt. I watched them remove yesterday's jar, carefully, like handling something sacred, and replace it with a new one. Fresh flowers. Even in the darkness, I could see the white of the petals. The ritual took less than 2 minutes. The figure stood, turned, and walked back the way they'd come. Not hurrying, not skulking. Moving with the steady purpose of someone performing an obligation so ingrained it had survived the apocalypse. I should have called out. I should have followed. Instead, I sat frozen in the maintenance shed, hand axe across my knees, heart hammering against my ribs. Because here's what stopped me. The figure moved through that cemetery with absolute familiarity in near total darkness. They knew this ground. They knew it better than I did. And I'd spent 6 years walking these paths. I waited until full dawn before leaving the shed. The new jar contained tulips this time, red ones, vivid as arterial spray against the gray headstone. Fresh cut, which meant somewhere nearby, someone was maintaining a garden, or had access to one, in a dead town, during an outbreak. The mystery deepened, and with it, something I hadn't felt since Tuesday. Purpose. Friday morning, I followed the trail. The figure had entered and exited through the southern wall breach. Beyond that section lay a wooded slope descending toward Grayfield's eastern residential district. Older homes, larger lots, the kind of neighborhood where people kept gardens and fruit trees and privacy hedges that had grown tall over decades. I armed myself with a hand axe and a length of iron rebar I'd pulled from the maintenance shed's supply rack. I filled a water bottle. I told myself I was conducting reconnaissance, that I needed to know if this person was a threat or an ally, that the strategic value of another survivor outweighed the risk of exposure. The truth was simpler. I was desperately lonely. 3 days of absolute isolation had begun to erode something structural in my psyche. I talked to myself. I narrated my actions in a whisper. I'd caught myself having an extended conversation with a photograph of Mrs. Chen that hung in the cottage. Loneliness in the apocalypse isn't poetic. It's corrosive. It eats your judgment and replaces it with need. I descended through the trees carefully. The woods were thick enough to provide cover, but thin enough to maintain sight lines. I watched for movement, listened for the wrong kind of sound, that arrhythmic shuffling that characterized the infected, the wet grinding of teeth that the radio had warned about before going silent. Nothing. The woods were empty. Birds had returned. I heard a cardinal somewhere to my left, singing like the world hadn't ended. Nature's indifference to human catastrophe has always struck me as the cruelest form of honesty. At the tree line, I paused. Before me spread Ashworth Lane, a curving street of Victorian homes with deep yards and mature landscaping. Several houses showed signs of hasty departure, open doors, belongings scattered on porches, a car with its driver's side door hanging wide at the curb. But no damage. No fire, no obvious violence, and no infected. Their absence disturbed me more than their presence would have. The town below was full of them. I'd seen them from the ridge, wandering in clusters through the commercial district. But here, on this quiet street, nothing moved. As if something was keeping them away, or someone. I moved along the tree line, studying the houses. Third from the eastern end, a property stood out. Its gate was closed, its hedges were trimmed, and in its side yard, visible through a gap in the fence, I saw a greenhouse. A functioning greenhouse with condensation on its glass panels, proof of warmth, water, cultivation. I watched the house for an hour. No movement inside, no sound. But the greenhouse was real. And greenhouses meant plants, and plants meant someone was caring for them. Someone who cut flowers before dawn and carried them up a hill to honor a woman 7 years dead. I should have approached the front door, should have knocked, should have announced myself like a rational human being seeking alliance in a crisis. Instead, I retreated to the cemetery. Because something else had caught my attention during that hour of watching. Something that rearranged my understanding of the situation entirely. On the porch of the house next door, the one with the open front door and the scattered belongings, I'd seen an infected. Sitting, not wandering, not hunting, sitting on the porch steps with its hands in its lap, facing the house with the greenhouse, motionless, patient, watching. The infected don't watch. They don't sit. They don't wait. Everything we'd been told, everything the broadcasts had described, they were driven by stimulus response. Movement, sound. They pursued and consumed. They didn't observe, but this one, he sat on those porch steps like a sentry, like a guard, like something that had been placed there deliberately. I returned to the cottage with more questions than I'd left with, and a growing certainty that whatever was happening on Ashworth Lane was far stranger than one grieving daughter leaving flowers for her dead mother. Saturday morning, day 5. I woke before dawn and positioned myself at the southern wall, waiting. At 4:52 a.m., the figure appeared again. Same dark coat, same careful movements, same ritual at Margaret Holloway's headstone. But this time, I was closer, 30 feet instead of 60. In the faint pre-dawn light, I saw more. The figure was a woman, small-framed, maybe 5'3". Her coat was an oversized navy peacoat that hung past her hips. Her hair was dark, pulled back. She moved with an economy that suggested either extreme fatigue or extreme control. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no looking around. She didn't look around. That's what struck me hardest. In a world where every shadow might contain your death, this woman walked through an open cemetery in darkness without once scanning her surroundings. Either she was suicidal, or she knew with absolute certainty that nothing here would harm her. Given what I'd seen on that porch, the sitting infected, the watching infected, I was beginning to suspect the latter. And that suspicion terrified me more than any shambling corpse ever could. She finished her ritual, stood, turned toward the southern wall. "Wait," I said. My voice came out cracked and thin. 5 days without speaking to another person had rusted my vocal cords. The woman froze. Not startled, frozen. The way prey freezes when a predator reveals itself. Calculated stillness. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said. I kept my hands visible. The hand axe was in my belt, but I didn't reach for it. "I live here, the groundskeeper's cottage. I've been watching you leave flowers." Silence. She didn't turn, didn't run. Stood absolutely still with her back to me, the jar from yesterday held against her chest. "My name is Daniel Morse. I volunteer with the Heritage Trust. I maintain the records." Slowly, so slowly I could count her vertebrae rotating, she turned. I couldn't make out her features clearly in the darkness, but I saw her eyes. Wide, assessing, not afraid, something more complex than fear. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was quiet and precise, controlled. "You should have left days ago." "There's nowhere to go." "There's everywhere to go, anywhere but here." "Why? What's here?" She studied me for a long moment. Then she looked past me, toward the cottage, toward the ridge, toward the town below. When her gaze returned to mine, something had shifted in her expression. A decision made. "My name is Ruth," she said. "That's my mother's grave." Ruth Holloway Park, the daughter, the devoted one. Standing in a cemetery at 5 in the morning during the end of the world, holding a dirty jar like a communion chalice. "I know who you are," I said. "From the records. Your mother, you visited every Sunday." "The flowers." "Yes." "You live on Ashworth Lane, the house with the greenhouse." Her expression tightened. Something like anger passed across her features, quick and hot and immediately controlled. "You've been watching me. I've been trying to understand. You walk through an infected zone in darkness. You aren't afraid. And I hesitated. There's something on your neighbor's porch that shouldn't be sitting still. Ruth looked at me for a long time. The sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern horizon. Dawn coming. The world revealing itself in increments. Come to the house, she said finally. But come now, before full light, and Daniel. She paused at the wall breach, half turned. Don't bring the axe. I left it in the cottage. I followed her through the trees. I had never in my life felt more like I was walking into something I wouldn't be able to walk back from. The house on Ashworth Lane was a Victorian two-story, painted sage green with white trim. In the early dawn light, it looked almost normal. A home from before, preserved in amber while the world outside rotted. The garden was maintained. The porch was swept. Curtains hung straight in the windows. And on the porch next door, the infected man sat exactly where I'd seen him the day before. Same position, hands in lap, facing Ruth's house. As we approached along the tree line, I watched him. He didn't react to our movement, didn't turn his head, didn't twitch. Just sat, facing forward, like a man meditating on an autumn morning. Don't look at him, Ruth said. Come inside. I followed her up the porch steps, through the front door, into a dim hallway that smelled of soil and something faintly chemical, like a biology lab. Clean, preserved. She closed the door behind us and engaged 3 separate locks. Sit, she said, gesturing toward a kitchen at the end of the hall. I'll make tea. You have propane stove. The gas still flows in this neighborhood. I don't know why. The kitchen was orderly. Clean dishes stacked, a shelf of canned goods organized by category, a small radio on the windowsill switched off, and on the kitchen table, spread in a careful array, something that stopped me cold. Notebooks, dozens of them. Composition books filled with cramped handwriting, diagrams, charts, observations. The topmost page was visible. Columns of numbers, times, dates. A record of something systematic. Ruth filled a kettle, set it on the stove, lit the burner with a match. Her movements were precise and unhurried. The movements of someone who had built a controlled environment within the chaos and refused to let urgency crack its walls. You're studying them, I said. Not a question. She turned, leaned against the counter, crossed her arms. In the kitchen's dim light, I could see her clearly for the first time. Mid-40s. Thin, not from starvation, but from the kind of tension that burns calories through sheer cortisol output. Dark circles under intelligent eyes. A small scar on her chin. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, but was functioning through pure disciplinary force. I'm a microbiologist, she said. Was. At the university in Fairhaven. I was home visiting when the outbreak started. Tuesday, I was in my mother's garden cutting flowers for her grave when the first sirens went off. By the time I tried to drive out, the roads were blocked. So you stayed. I stayed. And I watched. She nodded toward the notebooks. It's what I'm trained to do. Observe, record, analyze. And what have you observed? The kettle began to whistle. She poured water over tea bags and 2 mugs, handed me one, sat across from me at the table. The infection isn't what they told us, she said. It's not rage, it's not destruction, it's not mindless. She paused, choosing her words with scientific precision. It's restructuring. The infected aren't losing their minds. They're being reorganized. Neural architecture isn't destroyed. It's repurposed. I set my tea down, the one on the porch next door. Thomas Chen. He was my neighbor for 12 years. Retired accountant, loved crossword puzzles, turned Wednesday morning. She met my eyes steadily. He's been sitting on that porch for 4 days, hasn't moved, hasn't attacked anyone. He just watches. Watches what? Me, the house, the greenhouse. She pulled one of the notebooks toward her, flipped to a marked page. I have 17 documented cases of infected individuals exhibiting non-aggressive behavioral patterns within a 3-block radius. Sitting, standing, watching. They form a perimeter. Daniel, they're protecting this house. The tea grew cold in my hands. Outside, the dawn light crept across the yard, and I could see the greenhouse clearly through the kitchen window. Its glass panels catching the early sun, the shapes of plants pressing against its walls like something alive and breathing. Why? I asked. Ruth turned her notebook toward me. On the page was a drawing, precise, labeled, scientific. A flower, a lily, and beneath it, a molecular diagram I couldn't begin to interpret. Because of what I'm growing, she said. The greenhouse was Ruth's cathedral. She led me through the back door, across a flagstone path, through a heavy glass door that she unlocked with a key she wore around her neck. Inside, the air was thick and humid, alive in a way the outside world had forgotten how to be. Rows of planting beds lined both walls, and above them hung UV grow lights, powered by a generator I could hear humming beneath the floor. Sub-basement generator, Ruth explained. My father installed it after the ice storm in 2003. Runs on propane. Same line that feeds the kitchen. I have enough fuel for approximately 6 more weeks. The plants weren't what I expected. No vegetables, no survival crops. Instead, every bed contained flowers. Lilies, tulips, chrysanthemums, roses, in various stages of growth. But they were wrong. The colors were too saturated, the stems too rigid. The leaves carried a faint iridescence that ordinary flowers don't possess. These aren't natural, I said. They started natural. My mother's garden varieties, the same ones I've been planting on her grave for years. But after the outbreak, I noticed something. Ruth moved to a workbench at the greenhouse's far end, where a microscope sat beside racks of glass slides. The infection is fungal, not viral. The broadcasts got it wrong, probably deliberately, probably because the implications of a fungal pathogen with neural integration capability were too terrifying for public communication. Fungal. Cordyceps adjacent. Massively evolved. It interfaces with neural tissue and redirects motor function, decision pathways, behavioral patterns. But here's what nobody reported. It also communicates through chemical signals, pheromones, volatile organic compounds. And the compounds it responds to most dramatically are produced by flowers in the Lilium genus. Specifically, varieties my mother hybridized in this greenhouse over 30 years of amateur cultivation. I stared at her. You're saying your mother's flowers produce a compound that interacts with the fungal network. The infected near this house aren't protecting me. They're protecting the flowers, the greenhouse, the source of the compound they're responding to. I sank onto a wooden stool beside the workbench. The implications cascaded through my mind like dominoes falling. The flowers you leave on your mother's grave create a safe zone. The infected won't enter an area saturated with the compound. It's why the cemetery is clear. It's why this block is quiet. The lilies. She gestured at a bed of white flowers identical to the ones I'd seen on Margaret Holloway's headstone. They're a repellent, or more accurately, a pacifier. The fungal network reads the compound as something, I'm not sure yet. A territorial marker, maybe. An authority signal. Something that tells it this ground is claimed. Ruth? My voice was barely above a whisper. Do you understand what this means? I understand exactly what it means. She sat on the stool opposite me, her hands flat on the workbench, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd been carrying an impossible secret alone for 5 days. It means my mother accidentally bred the only defense against the end of humanity in her backyard greenhouse. And it means I'm the only person who knows how to propagate it. I looked at the flowers, at their too bright petals and their wrong-colored leaves, at the microscope and the notebooks and the systematic mind that had unraveled a mystery while the rest of us were hiding and dying. You need help, I said. I need someone to maintain the perimeter placements while I work on scaling production. I need someone to help me map the safe zones. I need someone who knows this cemetery, every grave, every path. Because the elevated ground and the stone walls make it the ideal distribution center. She paused. I need a partner, Daniel. Not a savior, a partner. I extended my hand across the workbench. She looked at it for a moment, then took it. Her grip was firm and brief. Tell me what to do, I said. Outside the greenhouse, Thomas Chen sat on his porch, watching without malice. And somewhere in this building, white flowers grew that could change the arithmetic of extinction. Ruth's system was elegant in its simplicity. Every 24 hours, the cut flowers degraded enough that the compound weakened. That's why she replaced them every morning. Not grief, not ritual, but biochemistry. The fresh blooms at Margaret's grave weren't an offering. They were a transmitter, broadcasting a chemical signal across the hilltop that kept the cemetery inside a bubble of protection. She'd mapped the effective radius, approximately 40 meters from a fresh arrangement. By placing jars at strategic points along the cemetery's perimeter wall, she'd created an overlapping network of safe zones that covered the entire grounds. 7 placement points, refreshed daily. I've been doing it alone, she told me over a second cup of tea. But it takes 90 minutes each morning to cut, arrange, and place all 7. That's 90 minutes I'm not in the lab, not working on cultivation, not trying to figure out how to produce enough compound to expand the safe zone beyond this hill. My role became immediately clear. I would maintain the placements. I knew the cemetery's geography, every section, every row, every maintenance path. I could complete the route in half the time Ruth could. We spent Saturday establishing protocol. She showed me the cutting technique. Always at the base of the second node, always at a 45-degree angle, always placed in water within 3 minutes of cutting to prevent compound volatilization. The precision mattered. The margin between protection and exposure was narrower than I'd imagined. If you cut wrong, the compound dissipates in 6 hours instead of 24, she explained, demonstrating with a scalpel. If you place them in stale water, you'll lose 30% efficacy. If you wait too long between cutting and placement, the volatile compounds gas off, and you're carrying nothing but a pretty flower. By Saturday afternoon, I'd practiced enough to satisfy her standards. We established a schedule. I would begin placements at 4:30 a.m., completing the circuit by 5:15. Ruth would use that time for laboratory work, attempting to isolate the specific compound, synthesize it, find a way to produce it without relying on living flowers that took weeks to grow. What happens if you can't scale it? I asked. She looked at me with the flat pragmatism of a scientist facing an uncomfortable variable. Then this protection covers one cemetery and one city block, indefinitely, as long as I can maintain cultivation. But it doesn't spread. doesn't help anyone beyond shouting distance. And if you can synthesize it, then theoretically, any surface could become a safe zone. Buildings, roads, entire neighborhoods. The compound could be distributed, replicated, deployed. She paused. But I'm a microbiologist, not a chemist. The compound is complex. I'm working at the edge of my expertise with improvised equipment. That evening, I moved my supplies from the cottage to Ruth's spare bedroom. The cottage was inside the safe zone, but it was isolated. Here, on Ashworth Lane, I had a partner, resources, and a mission. The spare room had belonged to Ruth's daughter, a teenager named Sophie, whose photograph smiled from the dresser. She was at her father's in Seattle, Ruth said when she saw me looking. I haven't been able to reach anyone since Tuesday. I didn't ask if Seattle was infected. We both knew the answer. The outbreak had been nationwide before the broadcasts died. Instead, I said, "She looks like you. She has her father's stubbornness." Ruth's voice caught, just barely, just for a moment. And then she straightened and returned to her notebooks. That was the last time she mentioned Sophie voluntarily for 9 days. Sunday morning, I performed my first solo placement run. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, but I'd memorized the route. 7 points, 7 jars, 7 arrangements of white lilies cut precisely and placed with care. I moved through the cemetery like a priest performing communion. The same sacred repetition, the same desperate faith that the ritual meant something. At the 7th point, the main gate, I paused. Below, Grayfield lay in total darkness. But near the base of Cemetery Hill Road, I could see shapes, 6 or 7 infected, standing at the road's edge, facing uphill, facing me. They stood motionless in the darkness, their postures slack, their faces turned toward the ridge. They weren't approaching. The compound held them at bay, but they were aware. They knew something was here, something that mattered to whatever networked intelligence animated their ruined bodies. I finished the placement and returned to the house. Ruth was already in the greenhouse, bent over her microscope. The generator hummed. The flowers grew. And the infected stood at the base of our hill like pilgrims waiting for a temple to open its doors. By Wednesday, day 10, we had established a rhythm. Mornings, I handled the placements while Ruth worked. Afternoons, we discussed findings, reviewed her notebooks, planned. Evenings, I cooked whatever we had while she recorded observations from the day. It was on Wednesday that someone else found us. I was completing my morning route, approaching the 3rd placement point along the eastern wall, when I heard a sound that didn't belong. A human voice. Not a word, a moan. Low, pained, conscious, coming from outside the wall. I set down the jar and climbed the wall's interior face to peer over. Below, on the wooded slope, a man lay against a tree trunk, middle-aged, bleeding from a wound on his left arm. Conscious, barely. He was dressed in outdoor clothing, hiking boots, cargo pants, a technical jacket, not local attire. "Hey," I called softly. "Can you hear me?" His head moved, eyes opened, focused on me with desperate effort. "Please," he whispered. "They're coming." I looked past him down the slope. In the early light, I could see movement between the trees. 3 infected, maybe 4, moving uphill in that distinctive mechanical gait. They were 50 meters below the man, maybe 3 minutes out. Decision point. Ruth had been explicit. No one else enters the safe zone without her authorization. The compound's protection was finite. More people meant more risk, not just resources, but the chance of someone disrupting the placements, damaging the greenhouse, introducing chaos. But the man was alive. Wounded and alone and alive, with the dead walking toward him through the trees. I dropped the jar over the wall. It shattered on the slope below, and the lilies scattered across the ground. Instantly, the infected below slowed, stopped. The ones closest to the broken jar turned away, retreating down the slope. The compound worked, even scattered, even dispersed in broken glass and spilled water. "Climb," I told the man. "The wall. Can you climb?" He dragged himself forward. I reached over, gripped his uninjured arm, pulled. He was heavier than he looked, solid, muscular beneath the jacket. It took 30 seconds of desperate effort to haul him over the wall and onto the cemetery ground. He collapsed on the grass, gasping. The wound on his arm was a bite, ragged, deep, already showing signs of infection at the edges. I knew what that meant. Ruth's broadcasts had confirmed it. "How long ago?" I asked, pressing my jacket against the wound. "Yesterday evening." His voice was stronger now, steadied by solid ground and the absence of immediate pursuit. "I was in the hills. Thought I'd cleared a path north. What's your name?" Marcus Webb." He looked around at the headstones, the morning light, the intact wall. "What is this place?" "Somewhere safe, for now." I studied the bite. It was bad. But Ruth had mentioned something, a note in her research about the compound's effect on early-stage infection. Something about it slowing the fungal colonization, something about buying time. "Can you walk?" I asked. "I think so." I helped him up, supported his weight, led him toward the house on Ashworth Lane with the growing certainty that I'd just made a decision Ruth would either thank me for or never forgive. Marcus Webb walked beside me through the cemetery, past headstones of people who died ordinary deaths in ordinary times, and I could see the fever already building in his eyes. The first heat of something foreign taking root. We had very little time. Ruth's reaction was exactly what I'd feared, and nothing like what I'd expected. She looked at Marcus's arm, looked at me. Then, without a word, she walked to the greenhouse and returned with 3 fresh-cut lilies and a mortar and pestle. "Hold him still," she said. She crushed the lily petals into a paste, green-white, pungent, releasing a smell like honey and copper. She packed it directly into the bite wound, while Marcus hissed through clenched teeth. Then she wrapped his arm in clean cloth and stepped back, studying him with clinical intensity. "If the compound works on surface tissue the way it works on neural pathways through airborne transmission," she said, speaking mostly to herself, "then direct application to the infection site might inhibit colonization locally. Buy time, not a cure, a delay." "How much time?" Marcus asked. His voice was strained but lucid. "I don't know. Hours, days. I've never tested it on a human subject." She met his eyes with unflinching honesty. "You might turn tonight. You might have a week. I genuinely don't know." Marcus absorbed this with a steadiness that surprised me. He nodded once. "Then I'd better be useful while I can." Over the next hour, he told us his story. Former Army medic, lived alone in a cabin 20 miles north of Grayfield. Had been trying to reach the military staging area rumored to exist near the coast. Fought through 3 days of infected territory before being bitten yesterday evening on the outskirts of town. "There's nothing at the coast," he said flatly. "I passed through Henderson and Millbrook on the way. Both overrun. No military presence anywhere. Whatever staging areas existed, they've been abandoned or destroyed. This wasn't surprising, but hearing it confirmed, extinguished a small flame of hope I hadn't realized I'd been harboring. There was no cavalry, no rescue, no perimeter of safety beyond the one Ruth had built with flowers and fury. "What can you do?" Ruth asked him. Not cold, pragmatic. The question of someone managing finite resources. "I'm a medic. I'm strong enough to work for now. I know field fortification, supply management, perimeter security." He paused. "And I'm not afraid of them. Not anymore." Ruth studied him for a long moment, then looked at me. Something passed between us. Not words, but a shared calculation. Another person meant another set of hands, another mind, but also another variable. And a ticking clock. "The spare room has a cot," she said finally. "Daniel will show you. Rest today. Tomorrow we'll see what you can still do." Marcus nodded. I led him upstairs. As we passed through the hallway, he paused at the window overlooking the neighbor's porch. Thomas Chen sat in his eternal vigil. "That one's not moving," Marcus said. "No, he's not." "Why?" "It's complicated. Ruth will explain tomorrow." Marcus looked at me with eyes that were already beginning to show the faintest amber tinge at the edges of his irises. The first visible sign. We both knew what it meant. "How long do you think I have?" he asked quietly. "I don't know. But Ruth is the smartest person I've ever met. If anyone can figure out how to help you, it's her." He nodded again. That military acceptance, that trained capacity to face bad odds with operational composure. He went into the spare room and closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long time, looking at Sophie's photograph, still smiling from the dresser visible through the crack in the door. Wondered if the universe had a sense of irony, putting a dying man in a dead girl's room. Wondered if Ruth was downstairs right now, staring at her notebooks, trying to calculate whether Marcus Webb was a gift or a burden or a test subject. The answer, I would learn, was all three. Marcus lasted longer than any of us expected. By day 15, the infection had progressed to his shoulder, visible beneath the skin as a branching network of amber veins that pulsed faintly in darkness. But his mind remained clear. Ruth's topical compound, reapplied every 8 hours, seemed to slow the fungal advance significantly, not stopping it, slowing it, like building a dam out of sandbags against a rising river. He worked despite the progression, reinforced the southern wall breach with salvage materials from neighboring houses, established a secondary water supply from a rainwater collection system he built in 2 days, organized our food stores with military precision, inventoried, rationed, projected. And he watched the infected with the same scientific intensity Ruth brought to her laboratory work. But where she saw biology, he saw tactics. "They're organized," he told us over dinner on day 15. "Canned chicken and rice, heated on the propane stove. Not randomly. They have positions. The ones at the base of the hill rotate every 36 hours. The ones on the surrounding streets maintain spacing. It's a formation." Ruth set down her fork. "You can see that from here?" "I've been mapping them. From the cemetery ridge, you can see their distribution across the whole eastern district. They're not wandering. They're deployed." He pulled a hand-drawn map from his pocket, crude but precise. Dots representing infected, arrows showing their movement patterns over days of observation. "This is a siege formation. They're surrounding this hill on 3 sides, leaving only the northern slope open." "The northern slope leads to nothing," I said. "Just wilderness. The highway's in the other direction." "Exactly." Marcus looked at us both with steady, amber-veined eyes. They're funneling. Anything that approaches from populated areas hits their perimeter. But the northern route, the route that leads away from any other survivors, any resources, any hope of spreading the compound, that's left open. The implications settled over the table like a cold fog. The fungal network wasn't just responding to the compound. It was strategizing around it, containing it, allowing Ruth to exist, to maintain her little pocket of safety, as long as that pocket remained isolated. Couldn't grow, couldn't spread. "They're quarantining us," Ruth whispered. "More than that." Marcus tapped his map. "They're adapting. When Daniel broke that jar on the slope last week, the 3 infected nearest to it retreated. But by the next day, 2 of them had repositioned closer, not within the compound's radius, just at its edge, testing the boundary, learning its limits." I thought of Thomas Chen on his porch. 4 days of motionless watching when I'd first seen him. Now, according to Marcus's observations, he shifted position every 12 hours. Incremental movements, closer each time by centimeters. "The compound is still working," Ruth said firmly. "They haven't breached. They haven't breached yet." Marcus's voice was gentle but unyielding. "Ruth, I have a fungal intelligence literally colonizing my nervous system. I can—" He stopped, looked at his hands. The amber veins pulsed beneath his skin. "I can feel it, learning me, reading my memories. It's not mindless. It's patient." Silence at the table. The propane stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, full dark had fallen, and somewhere in that darkness, the network calculated. "How much can it see?" I asked. "Through you?" Marcus met my eyes. "I don't know, but I think it knows about the greenhouse, about the compound, about Ruth. I think it's known since I walked through that gate." He paused. "I think it let me get bitten. Let me find you. Let me inside." Ruth stood abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor. She walked to the window, stared out at the darkness, arms crossed tight against her body. "Then we have less time than I thought," she said. "I need to synthesize the compound. Not manage it, synthesize it. Produce it independently of the flowers, before they adapt completely." The next 4 days were a siege of a different kind. Ruth barely slept. She worked in the greenhouse through all hours, the generator humming beneath her feet, the microscope her constant companion. She filled 3 new notebooks with molecular diagrams, attempted syntheses, failed experiments documented with the same meticulous precision as her successes. I maintained the placements, morning and evening now. Ruth had determined that twice daily replacement strengthened the barrier. 14 runs per day instead of 7. My world contracted to the rhythm of cutting and placing, a liturgy of survival performed in the spaces between darkness and dawn, dusk and dark. Marcus deteriorated. The amber veins reached his neck by day 17. By day 18, he reported the first auditory experience. Not voices, he insisted, but impressions, emotional textures that arrived unbidden. Hunger that wasn't his own, curiosity that felt foreign. "It's looking through me," he said on the morning of day 19. We were on the cemetery ridge, watching the town below. His eyes had taken on a permanent amber tinge, and in certain light, I could see the branching patterns beneath the skin of his face. Not controlling me, not yet, but it's aware of what I see, what I hear. "Then it knows everything," I said. "Probably." He was calm, that military composure holding even as his body was colonized from within. "But here's what's strange, Daniel. It's not hostile, not toward Ruth, not toward the flowers. It's—" He struggled for words. "Interested. the way a researcher is interested in something new. It wants to understand the compound, not destroy it, understand it. And when it understands it, then it adapts, overcomes it, makes it irrelevant. He looked at me. That's what fungal networks do. They encounter obstacles and they solve them. It's just a matter of time. I reported this to Ruth. She listened without stopping her work, hands steady on the microscope, adjusting focus, recording observations. Time is what I'm buying, she said. Every day the compound holds, I learn more about its molecular structure. I'm close, Daniel. The active component, it's a terpenoid variant, unique to my mother's hybrids, something she bred accidentally over decades of cross-pollinating. If I can identify the exact molecular structure, can you? I have a mass spectrometer in the university lab, 23 miles away, in the middle of the heaviest infection zone in the county. I leaned against the greenhouse workbench. That's not an option. No. She straightened from the microscope, rubbed her eyes. In the grow light's purple glow, she looked like something otherworldly, a scientist at the end of the world, racing against an intelligence that was learning to counter her defense, even as she worked to strengthen it. But I have another idea. The compound works because the fungal network reads it as an authority signal, something that says, this territory is claimed. What if I can amplify that signal? Not just passively, through cut flowers, actively, through living root systems connected to the soil itself. You want to plant them in the ground, permanently. The cemetery soil, the elevation, the stone walls. If I can establish a permanent growing colony of the hybrid lilies across the cemetery grounds, rooted and living, the compound output would be constant and self-renewing. No more daily placements, no more degradation. A permanent safe zone. It was elegant. It was possible. But it would take weeks for transplanted root systems to establish. Weeks we might not have, with the infected pressing closer each day, and a fungal intelligence looking through Marcus's eyes at everything we did. How long? I asked. To establish viable root systems. 3 weeks minimum, probably 4. And Marcus? Ruth paused, set down her pen, looked at me with the expression of someone who'd already done the calculation and didn't like the result. Marcus won't last 4 weeks, she said. I told Marcus that evening. He deserved the truth. He received it the way he received everything, straight-backed, clear-eyed, with the discipline of someone who'd faced mortality before and made an accommodation with it. How long do I have? He asked. Ruth thinks 10 days, maybe 12, before the cognitive integration becomes irreversible. We were sitting on the cemetery ridge, watching the sunset paint Grayfield in colors the dead town didn't deserve. Below, the infected stood at their posts, eternal sentries, patient consumers of time. Then I need to tell you something, Marcus said. While I still can, while my thoughts are still mine. I waited. The network, the fungal intelligence, it's not trying to destroy humanity. I know what it feels like from inside. It's trying to incorporate us. It doesn't see infection as violence. It sees it as communication, connection. It's reaching out. Every person it turns becomes another node in a vast conversation, a community of minds sharing experience across biological boundaries. Marcus, I'm not justifying it. I'm explaining it. Because understanding your enemy... He stopped, swallowed. The amber veins pulsed at his temples. Because understanding what we're dealing with matters for what comes next. What comes next? He turned to face me. The amber in his eyes had deepened. In the sunset light, They looked almost golden, beautiful in a terrible way, like watching a fire consume a cathedral. "It's going to offer a deal," he said. "Through me. Soon. It's been building toward it. I can feel the intent forming. Not words yet, concepts. It wants to negotiate." Every instinct in my body screamed wrong. The infected don't negotiate. They consume. But I looked at Thomas Chen on his porch, watching, waiting, patient beyond any human capacity for patience. And I wondered if the broadcasts had been wrong about everything. If what we'd called mindless was actually something so far beyond our framework of intelligence that we couldn't recognize it as thought. "What kind of deal?" I asked. "I don't know yet. The intent is forming, like watching a thought crystallize in someone else's mind." He rubbed his temples, an unconscious gesture as if trying to separate his thoughts from the foreign ones pressing against them. "Daniel, when it speaks through me, and it will, listen. Don't react with fear. Listen." "And Ruth?" "Ruth should hear it too. She'll understand the biological implications better than either of us." He paused. "But protect her. Whatever happens. She's the only one who can grow those flowers. She's the only one who holds the defense." I nodded. We sat together in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the darkness rolled in like the tide. Below, the infected watched. Above, the stars emerged, cold and indifferent and eternal. Somewhere inside Marcus Webb, a vast intelligence gathered its thoughts and prepared to speak. It happened on day 22. Morning. I was in the kitchen preparing for my placement run when Marcus came downstairs. I knew immediately that something had changed. His movements were different, still his own, still human in their articulation, but carrying an additional quality, a heaviness, a presence. He sat at the kitchen table, folded his hands. The amber veins covered his face now in delicate branching patterns, and his eyes glowed faintly in the pre-dawn dimness, not the glazed emptiness of the fully turned, but something between, something conscious and dual. "Daniel," he said. His voice was his own, but beneath it, like a harmonic, something else resonated. "I need to speak with both of you." I called Ruth. She came from the greenhouse, wiping soil from her hands, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw him. Her face went absolutely still, the controlled stillness of a scientist observing a phenomenon she'd theorized but never believed she'd witness. "Marcus?" she said. "Still here." He smiled, a small, sad smile that was entirely his own. "But not alone. I'm translating. It doesn't have language the way we do. It thinks in chemical signals, neural patterns, emotional textures. I'm the interpreter." Ruth sat down slowly. I remained standing, my back against the counter, hand near the drawer where we kept knives. Not that a knife would matter against a networked intelligence spanning an entire town. But the weight of a weapon is sometimes the only gravity that keeps you anchored. "Speak," Ruth said. Clinical, controlled. Marcus's eyes flickered, a momentary absence, then return. When he spoke again, his voice carried that dual quality more strongly. His words came slower, more deliberate, as if being assembled from unfamiliar components. "It wants to understand the compound," he said. "It's been studying it through the infected at your perimeter, through my biology. It recognizes the molecular structure as related to its own chemistry. The terpenoid compound is similar enough to its own signaling molecules that it reads it as a command, a territorial claim, an authority signal." "I know this," Ruth said. "I discovered it 2 weeks ago." "But you don't know what it wants to propose." Marcus leaned forward, his hands pressed flat on the table, steadying himself or being steadied. It's offering coexistence, not subjugation, coexistence. The compound defines a boundary. It respects boundaries. It's willing to accept permanent territories, zones where the compound holds, where humans remain uninfected, unconverted, islands of human autonomy within its network. In exchange for what? I asked. Cessation of attempts to weaponize the compound. No effort to expand the compound's range beyond established zones. No attempt to destroy or damage the fungal network itself. Marcus's eyes held mine. It's offering a truce, not a cure. A map with borders both sides agree not to cross. Ruth was silent for a long time. I watched her processing. The scientist in her evaluating the proposal's biological feasibility. The mother in her calculating what it meant for Sophie. The survivor in her measuring the cost of acceptance against the cost of refusal. The established zones, she said finally. How large? Wherever the compound currently reaches, the cemetery, this block. It would accept those as permanent human territory, but no expansion. That's a prison, I said. One block and a cemetery, for the rest of human existence. It's a beginning. Marcus's voice shifted. More his own now, their harmonic fading. They're offering to start small, prove the concept. If coexistence is stable, the territories could be renegotiated over time. But it needs trust, on both sides. Trust, Ruth repeated. The words sat between us like a stone. What happens if we refuse? I asked. Marcus closed his eyes. The amber veins pulsed once, brightly, then dimmed. When he opened his eyes again, they were entirely his own. Afraid, human, finite. Then it stops being patient, he said. It adapts to the compound, overcomes it, and the flowers stop working. Ruth and I stood in the greenhouse. Midnight. Marcus slept upstairs, or whatever hybrid state between sleep and network communion he now occupied. The grow lights hummed purple above us. The flowers grew in their careful rows, their wrong-colored petals closed for the night. We can't accept, Ruth said. She was pacing, the first time I'd seen her abandon her usual composed stillness. One block, one cemetery. It's offering us a zoo enclosure, a terrarium, 2 humans and a garden, preserved for observation while the entire species is absorbed. If we refuse, we lose the compound entirely. Maybe, maybe not. She stopped pacing, turned to face me. In the purple light, her exhaustion was visible as something structural. Not just tiredness, but the fundamental depletion of a mind that had been carrying too much for too long. The compound is a naturally occurring molecule. It evolved alongside the fungus, or alongside whatever ancestor the fungus descended from. It has millions of years of evolutionary authority behind it. The network can't simply adapt past it overnight. Marcus said, Marcus is compromised. Not unreliable, but compromised. The information flowing through him is filtered through the network's interests. If it tells us it can adapt past the compound, that might be true. Or it might be a negotiating tactic. Pressure to accept the deal. I hadn't considered this. The strategic dimensions of negotiating with a distributed intelligence that controlled your only source of information about its capabilities. We were playing chess against an opponent who could see our pieces and describe its own, in whatever configuration, served its interests. What's the alternative? I asked. If we refuse and call its bluff? I plant the cemetery. Every square foot. Living root systems producing compound constantly, in quantities that overwhelm any adaptive capacity. The network encounters an impenetrable zone it cannot cross and cannot overcome. And then She moved to her workbench, pulled out a notebook I hadn't seen before. Newer, the pages covered in calculations. Then I propagate. Seeds, bulbs, carried to other survivors. Planted everywhere, the soil will support them. The compound spreads faster than the network can adapt. Not a cure, a countermeasure. Distributed, decentralized, impossible to eliminate because it's everywhere. That's the long game. That's the only game that doesn't end with us in a cage. I looked at the flowers, at the careful rows of hybrid lilies that a retired amateur gardener had bred without knowing she was creating the molecular key to human survival. Margaret Holloway, who died of cardiac arrest in 2019, never knowing that her daughter would one day use her life's work to negotiate with an alien intelligence for the survival of the species. "Ruth," I said, "if we refuse and you're wrong about its adaptive capacity, then we lose everything." "Yes, I know." She met my eyes with absolute clarity. No wavering, no uncertainty. The expression of someone who'd already made their decision and was simply waiting for the world to align with it. "But Daniel, if we accept, we lose everything too. Just more slowly, a comfortable extinction inside a pretty cage." I thought about it, about the infected at the base of the hill, about Marcus upstairs, his mind slowly dissolving into something vast and inhuman, about Thomas Chen on his porch, patient as stone, about Sophie in Seattle and Ellen in Portland, and 26 junior history students whose faces I could still see when I closed my eyes. "Plant the cemetery," I said. Ruth nodded. Once, decisive. Tomorrow, we would tell Marcus, and through him, the network, that the answer was no. That the borders wouldn't be drawn by the thing that had consumed the world. That two people on a hill with flowers and fury were choosing war over a comfortable surrender. The flowers glowed faintly in the grow lights, their roots pressed against their beds, reaching for soil, reaching for ground, reaching for the cemetery above, where 400 dead lay in their honest graves, and one woman's life work waited to save the living. We planted the first row on day 23. Ruth's hybrid lilies, transplanted from the greenhouse into the soil beside her mother's grave. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Margaret Holloway's final gift to the world, growing from the earth above her bones. Marcus delivered our refusal. The network didn't respond with violence. It responded with silence, a withdrawal of the infected from their perimeter positions that lasted exactly 4 hours before they returned, repositioned, tighter, closer, testing the boundary with renewed purpose. Ruth was right. The compound held. The network pressed against it like water against a dam, searching for weakness, finding none. The living root systems produced compound with an intensity that cut flowers never could. Constant, renewable, rooted in the deep earth of a cemetery that had held the dead for over a century. We are still here. Day 31. The lilies have spread to 3 rows. Ruth has harvested seeds, viable, potent, carrying the compound in their genetic code. Somewhere out there, other survivors exist. We've seen signal fires on the northern hills. When the seeds are ready, when we have enough, I will carry them north. The dead rest beneath us. The flowers grow above them. And every morning, I still place a fresh jar on Margaret's grave. Not because the science demands it anymore, because some rituals outlive their origins and become something else entirely. Something like faith.